Hi everybody, I'm Dale Kingsmill, who, prologue like your humble patients pray, gently to hear, kindly to judge our Q&A.
Oh, for
I'm
a
here
muse
today.
of fire.
Oh, for a muse of fire. I'm here today with the wonderful James Introcaso and Matt Colville to do a little bit of a Patreon Q&A. Thank you so much for submitting your questions. A ton of stuff has happened since the last time we did one of these, not least of all, the crowdfunding campaign for the MCDM game.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, we raised some
Congratulations.
money. Yeah.
Just a little bit, just a
We're
little
making it
tiny
now.
bit. I know,
Yep.
right? Now you have to do it. You're locked in.
Yeah, now we're committed. Now we got to figure out how this stupid game works. It's our most successful crowdfunder, period. Which a lot of people,
It was
which,
over 30,000
which I think it's fair
backers,
to say.
right?
Yeah, we cracked, which we'd never done before. We had never done 30,000. And keep in mind that when you see the number of backers, that's just in that month. Once you can pre-order, that number keeps going up. So we've never had this kind of success before.
A lot of the questions that we got from the patrons for this particular Q&A, everyone's super interested in the feedback from this first playtest packet, the Patreon playtest packet that went out. And you've done a survey for feedback since then, and tons of people are asking, are there common threads emerging between responses? Whether you've been surprised by any of the findings. Has there been any kind of interesting threads picked up through that feedback?
So yeah, I am slowly making my way through all of the feedback right now. And so to give people an idea of what happens, and I wrote a Patreon post about this too. But essentially, I take a big view of everything holistically, and that's when we ask those 1 to 5 questions, like, hey, how satisfying was this on a scale of 1 to 5? And we go through individual rules and class options and other pieces of the game, right? And that gives me a big view of like, where are the majority opinions about things, right? But then we also read all of the comments, because the majority opinion doesn't design the game, right? Matt and I designed the game, and people we hire to work on the game design the game. So it's good to know where the majority opinions are and where people think there are issues, and we look into them. But it's also good to know, like, hey, maybe one person didn't like something that everybody else liked, or one person loved something that a bunch of people didn't like, and there's reasoning there about why, and it's like, we agree with that person, and there's a good insight there, and maybe we can keep this piece of it and still please the other people over here, right? It takes a long time to make it through the feedback. So that being said, there are some things that we have noticed in the feedback. I think I can talk about some of them. When it comes to negotiation, right now, people are split. Some people think it is the best thing and the best part about the game. Like, that's a direct quote. A lot of people are like, this is the secret sauce. This is what is going to make this work. And some people do not like negotiation and the way it's playing out right now. And so we have some ideas about ways to find marriages in between that, and hopefully keep the things that people really love about it and make it work. And then the people over here who don't like it as much, can we bring them on board, right? And get that to work, right? So that was one big thing. Was I knew that negotiation, people would have opinions. I wasn't expecting people to love it as much as they did. And I wasn't expecting people to dislike it as much as they did either, right? I thought we'd end up somewhere in the middle, and we have, like, the scores have, but that's because people are basically at either end of the spectrum when it comes to the system.
The idea of negotiation, everybody seems to agree this is a good idea. So they want to see us succeed with this design. And they're like, I liked the idea of patience and interest. I like the idea of these two numbers, because these are objective numbers that you explain using English words that everybody understands. And so everybody at the table understands what these numbers mean and what happens when they go up and down. You like that. You like motivations and pitfalls less, right? So there was a lot of very positive reaction to interest and patience. Not so much positive reaction to motivations and pitfalls. Well, the thing that patience and interest have in common is their numbers, their objective values, right? Whereas motivation and pitfalls are just notional concepts that the director has to come up with, and the players sort of have to do some research, do a little bit of digging, find out what motivates these people. And so what I proposed, and we haven't tried this, we haven't even written it down, is motivations and pitfalls should be canonical. There should be N motivations. Here are the 9 motivations that characters have. here are the 6 pitfalls, right? And they're broad categories. They're obviously not specific incidents. But if you knew that, oh, this person's motivated by glory, right? You're like, okay, I know what that means, right? Because that's on the list. That's one of the 6 motivations, sort of like the Aristotelian unities. That's one of the things that we all agree and we all know what that means. How this character is motivated by this, that can just be a detail. And I think that's probably going to move the needle. It's going to make it so that players feel like, okay, we're not just here and it's the Wild West and any motivation and any pitfall is possible. I also think that puts too much of a burden on the director when they're coming up with these things. Jacob Cooper says almost like an alignment chart. Yeah, sort of.
Another thing that we've noticed is that people want some more variability in damage, right? That's a big thing that's come across. And that's something we actually noticed before the survey even closed, like kind of right away when feedback responses were coming in. People were like, hey, this 2d6, we love the 2d6 roll. We like a lot of aspects of it. But the fact that everybody is dealing somewhere between 10 and 15 damage pretty much every time they roll is doesn't feel great, particularly on the director's end, right? That people who are directors, because they have different creatures, those different creatures, their damage outputs were feeling the same. That's a big thing that we have been tinkering with. We don't really have much to talk about in terms of specifics because we want to test a lot of different ideas and solutions, and we've tested some and we've come up with some others.
Yeah.
So we don't have a ton to talk about in how we're going to fix it, but we do have ideas and we are excited about them.
This is an ongoing theme with our development, is a lot of things we're excited by and we think this is working turn out to have things inside them. Like, no one misses rolling for damage, rolling to hit. No one misses the attack roll. It's a huge instant home run out of the gate. No attack roll. Well, no attack roll and you are always rolling 2d6 are not the same thing. Right? So we kind of bundled them together and we were excited about them at the same time. But in point of fact, that's 2 different things. No attack roll is one thing, but that's not going anywhere. Am I rolling 2d6 every time I attack? That we are auditing that very heavily right now.
And then there have been a lot of other great little insights along the way, but those are kind of the
tons of stuff.
That was the surprising one, was about negotiation, and one of the big things you're going to see coming out of this is damage related.
Curtis Thornton says being beloved and hated in the feedback is surely better than being meh. Kind of leads into a question from Roman Penner as well. When there doesn't seem to be consensus on a specific mechanic or area of design, like there are 2 clearly different opinions and camps on the matter, how do you decide what the problem is and whether it needs solving? And then my question on top of that is, how do you begin to approach something that's coming out really mid in all of the feedback?
Looking through the survey, I haven't seen those reactions. Our mid reaction is a 4 out of 5.
Yeah.
Like, that's where you can sort of like the spread we're seeing is every question we're asking, things are incredibly heavily weighted. 60% of respondents are voting 4 or 5, and that's the minimum. It's not unusual that 80% of responses are in the 4 to 5 range. And then it's just sometimes it's 4 to 5, and sometimes it's 4 to 5. It's like, well, okay, this is obviously working. This is something that we feel like, well, is there a way to improve this?
I mean, a lot of times when there is something that we see as a problem, it really depends on the specific issue, right? So in terms of if something is mid or if something is divided between 2 camps, right? Often what it'll be is, we'll sit down and think, right? It's my job to make the changes to the rules. So sometimes it is a simple thing. Sometimes it's like, I can see why this group does not like this, and I see why this group loves it, and they're actually not related. So all I need to do is change this thing over here, and the people who hate it maybe will come over to this side because I'm not changing the thing that people love about this system, right? So like, for example, right, let's take critical hits, right? A lot of people love the way critical hits work in the system, that you get an extra action because it's always useful for people when it comes up and it's never a letdown, right? A lot of people don't like them because it's hard to know. Right now they happen on 11 or 12, right? And that is a little harder to track than if they just always happened on a 12. That's not necessarily how we're going to change that rule, but it's a good way to look at that and say, like, we can keep what people love about this and change what people don't like, right? And find a way to marry those things together. Sometimes you can't do that. Or sometimes something is just meh, right? Like, it's like on a scale of 1 to 5, everybody gave it a 3, right? And to me, that is a failing grade, essentially, right? Like, I know that in school that would be a C and passable, but for us, right, that is like, nope, we got to rethink this. There's a certain point in the timeline where meh could become acceptable, but we are not at that point yet. I would like to not have anything that is meh when we go to print.
Sometimes things just need to work. They don't need to be sexy or exciting.
Where do you draw that line between something just being functional and something being like a standout feature? And we did have a lot of questions centered around generally non-combat kind of encounters and scenes, but also specifically several questions about the skill system. Multiple people have brought up that the current skill system feels to them very similar to the current 5e skill system that they're familiar with. And it makes me wonder, how important is it for any given subsystem to feel distinct from existing popular games that are out there? And how do you decide which subsystems get that kind of attention and which ones don't?
Part of our philosophy when we're approaching this is we want to make a game, right, that is functional and fun to play. And so if something feels like another game, it's probably because we think that that is fun. But we're also early in development, right? Like we're constantly having discussions about like what are skills for, right? And that's a discussion that we still need to have. And so some things are sort of in there because you need skills to play a functional game. But that system could change a little bit. But I think there's also something to be said for familiarity. We know a lot of people who are coming to this will be coming from 5e. And so seeing something that they recognize instead of saying, hey, skills, you actually use a Jenga tower and you play a game of Jenga every time you make a skill check, right? I think that would make some people's eyes roll around in their head because they would be so surprised and shocked by that. And so there's a certain amount of like, hey, we're weighing things and we're looking at different things and like, is this functional? Is it not? But everything is still being tested, right? Skills could still change dramatically at this point. But I also think that like one reason the skill system is the way it is when you have a lot of skills in a system that already has characteristics, right? One way to do that is to combine these things together and to have a pass-fail mechanic because it puts less of a burden on the director. And I would also argue that most parts of our game, as many nerds on the internet will tell you, could be from some other game. Right? That it's just that people recognize this one because it's from D&D.
Also, there's a phrase, there's a principle of game development when you're working in video games that tends to separate the new employees from the experienced ones. Is that the new employees tend to get really excited by the new shiny. Oh, there's this new software package that if we buy and plug into our game engine, all of a sudden we get all these awesome features. And then the old people at the studio are like, has any other game ever used those things? Oh no, it's brand new. It's like, okay, well, let someone else be the guinea pig. Why are we using this old junky, buggy fucking software that everybody hates? It ships games. Like the fact that we know this works, even if it's ugly and it's kind of junky and it's buggy, but we know it ships games, that has enormous value in game development. Because you would be really surprised, I think, at how many games never make it across the finish line. So for us, there's a bunch of stuff in this game right now that might not be obvious to the patrons. That it's like, well, the only reason it's in here the way it is now is because we needed to put something there, and that was fine, right? Like the skill system that will work. It's fine. Is there a better version of that skill system? Maybe, but we know that we could ship our game with this one and it would work. Right. So that lets us concentrate on other shit. Right. And then once we get the other shit working that we're happy with, then there's certain points and there's no science to this. I think it's time to go revisit this this decision we made literally a year ago that it got us here, but maybe there's a better version of it. And if there's not, it's not the end of the world. Or maybe there is a better version. We just couldn't find it. We're not omniscient, but the one we have is fine.
I'm excited to have that conversation about skills too at some point, but it's just not time for it yet.
We do know that there are going to be focuses on non-combat scenarios. We've talked about the negotiation system, so we already know that role-play encounters are going to have a larger role to play. Thank you so much. I wrote that in my notes, which means that yesterday I thought that's funny enough that I don't want to forget it. So we do know that the game is about more than just combat. And Graham Schofield asks, what sort of out-of-combat scenes do you think will or won't be part of the core experience? And they give the example of shopping scenes. What kind of things will or won't get that focus, do you think, at this stage?
So in addition to negotiation, there are going to be scenes where you are interacting with the skill system to do things like what currently we're calling a complex test. It's sort of like a 4th edition skill challenge, but with rules that will help the GM make those things happen, the director make those scenes more robust and more interesting. And they're like montage scenes, right? Where you are accomplishing a task together. And maybe you're like preparing a village for an invasion, right? Or trying to cross a desert to get to a city to warn them that a bunch of gnolls are invading before the gnolls get there, right? All that kind of stuff. These cool montage scenes are probably going to be part of this. We also envision that downtime scenes are going to be part of this game in terms of like you're doing research and you're crafting, right? That's going to be a big part of this as well. But then you'll also have scenes where you're like sneaking up on a camp of kobolds, checking a passageway as you go down it, interacting with a guard at a door is not a negotiation, but it is like a social interaction scene that you might have. So some scenes that you might expect to see in sort of a typical fantasy role-playing game will be part of this as well. I don't know that this is necessarily a game where you like are sweeping the floor checking for traps all the time, but it might be a game where a trap is a big set piece part of an encounter like we see in the playtest adventures, right? But those are the sorts of things that we expect people to do, and there will be mechanics for them to interact in these other types of scenes that are not just combat scenes.
Will there be class, kit, ancestry, what have you abilities associated with non-combat scenarios like negotiations, or
Yes.
are you expecting most of the abilities tied to those things to become Yes.
Yeah, I mean, so right now we
sure.
just have nothing is more developed than combat is right now, right? And combat's a big part of the game. There's a whole book of monsters to fight that comes with this game. So that's a big part of it, and it's the part we started with first. But yes, you will absolutely have class abilities, ancestry abilities, and things like that. You already see some that are not combat related, right? For instance, the talent has telepathy, can talk to people, with their mind. That is, sure. Could you use it in combat? Absolutely, but it's not really made to be used in combat, right? The high elf has an ability, a glamour, right, that gives them a boon on charm tests, right? So we're already putting those in the game, and you will see more of those, especially as we develop these other parts of the game. Right now, I can't make rules for research because I don't know how research works.
We need these other systems to be more robust and online before we can start designing exceptions and bonuses to them. But, we expect that the swashbuckler is probably going to be good at negotiation. What does that mean, though? We don't know. We don't yet know enough about the negotiation system. Something I wrote, some design exists somewhere where I said, it's the language system. Like I did a whole write-up. It's not finished, but I did a whole write-up for how language might work in our game. One of the things I wrote was, depending on the relationship between the language you speak and the language of the person you're negotiating speaks, you could automatically begin a negotiation, and they start with one greater patience. They will be more patient with you because you speak their native language. I finished a prototype of a fire mage. This isn't the first time we've done a fire mage in our game, but our rules have changed a lot since the last time, so we needed to start again on this. And every time you spend essence on a spell, spells have an element associated with them: earth, air, fire, water, green, rot, and void. Every time you spend essence on a fire spell, you gain fire lore, right? Which makes progress in the research system that doesn't exist yet, right? But that's a non-combat thing. Like gaining fire lore is, what you do. That's a downtime research thing, and we're already trying to future-proof the design in that way.
Lots of people are actually very interested specifically in the Elementalist's design, seemingly because it's been mentioned that it's challenging as a process right now. There was a suggestion from someone that part of the challenge has been the difficulty in defining the purpose of the Elementalist within the game. And Christian Lang or Lange says, what are the reasons that some of the other classes exist in the game? What are the reasons for them to exist? What is it about, say, the tactician or the talent that gives them a purpose where the elementalist is lacking one currently?
Well, it all comes down to the archetype. It all comes down to it being inspired by none of us come to this game, regardless of whether or not you're a designer or a tester or just a regular customer. None of us come to this game tabula rasa, having never encountered human culture before, right? And so we arrive at the table with these archetypes in our head, and every creative endeavor is a tension between the familiar and the new. And if it's too familiar, you're like, I've seen this, and you write it off, and it doesn't interest you. Boring. If it's too challenging, if it's too new, you're like, what even is this? I don't recognize it. So that's the process. The process is trying to find those archetypes that are familiar. That's what makes it archetypal, but then coming up with a way to present it in a new way. So there's nothing new about the warrior archetype, the fighting man, to use the original D&D term for it. There's nothing new about the fighter class. Yes. Right? But reimagining it in a way, talking about the thing isn't how good you are at swinging your sword. The thing is, you're the tactical genius. You're the professional, right? And that makes you more of a leader, not a striker, right? You're being a tactician is not about how much damage you do. You do damage, but it's all about how you become a force multiplier for the entire team, right? Like Captain America is by no stretch of the imagination. Like he's almost a normal person on a team with literal gods, right? But he's the guy that is the force multiplier. He makes them all better at what they do. So that is that's a great archetype. It's really exciting. So how do we take this familiar thing and make it really cool? Same thing is true of like the shadow. Like, one of the things I said when I was working on the fire mage was anyone could design a fire mage for this game now. Like if you're a patron and you played the playtest and you just know how heroic resources work. Oh, I get it. So a fire mage in this game would have a couple of his signature abilities that do fire damage and get me my heroic resource. And then I have some spells that cost my heroic resource, and they do more fire. Yep, that's exactly how it works, right? Okay, well, how do you make it more interesting than that? And that's again that design would ship a game. If there was just the class where it's like I do fire, people would be like, thank you, that's all I wanted. But it's we who set this bar of quality for but is there a better version of that, right? And so, for instance, when I was working on the fire mage, I was like, well, what is elemental? We already have the pyrokinetic. Are the pyrokinetic and the fire mage just two flavors of the same thing? That would be a letdown. It probably would be fine if they were, right? But let's do some work and figure out what's the difference between psionic fire and elemental fire. And then because we want to future-proof the design, I added a column, and that was hellfire. I was like, what if we want another type of class that does hellfire? Can we figure out what those differences are? Because that's new. That's not a distinction that D20 Fantasy makes. And so if we can take these archetypes and then plus them somehow. So it starts with us being inspired. I would say 7 times out of 10, it starts with us being inspired. 3 times out of 10, we are just aware that this archetype exists. And the Elementalist is one of those. A lot of these we are aware this archetype exists. Let's see if we can't juice it up and make it more interesting and exciting.
There was a lot of discussion on the relationship between dice mechanics and fun in connection with this 2d6 questioning. So broadly, a lot of the questions boil down to, I would call it like the mouthfeel of a given function, the possibility of altering the core 2d6 roll for some classes or monsters to make it feel more dynamic was the thing that people brought up. And Guillaume Gentil asks, what is the link between the statistics of a roll and the fun of it? Is your design led by one of those things more than the other?
Certainly fun is king, right? When we're doing something, there's a lot of times where, and this happened when testing Arcadia stuff and Flea Mortals monsters and everything else we've ever made, right? Like a big part of testing is, hey, we know on paper this works. Is it fun, right? Like if we could just look at everything statistically on paper and know it was going to work, that would be amazing. Right? And products would come out way faster. But the thing is that you gotta get out there and you gotta play it and you gotta try it because fun is really the most important. So in respect to that last question, right? Like it doesn't matter if something statistically should be fun. It's only fun if it's actually fun. And so that's a big part of that. In terms of the 2d6, the 2d6 is dialed in because it was fun, right? Like, we were doing all of this different stuff with funky dice at the beginning of this process, which are dice with symbols on them, right? Like the Star Wars Fantasy Flight dice. And I kept tweaking the numbers until everybody was like, this version feels great. And it was like, okay. And I looked at the probability curve, and it was basically the same as a 2d6. That point, we were like, everybody has a game of Monopoly. We should just use 2d6. So fun led us to 2d6 in that regard. We are thinking about, right, like I said at the beginning of this, we're thinking about the damage roll, and Matt talked about how that interacts with dice. There's a couple of different ways to do that, but we're definitely open to playing with different kinds of dice at this point.
There's another axis, which is like, when we were originally testing the game, we made a lot of progress really quickly, and it was very encouraging. But if you could go back and look at those characters that we were playing in, like July, for instance, they had a shitload of abilities. They could do a lot of stuff, and one character was really complicated. There was like a whole sequence that I live tweeted in a playtest about my tactician and the incredible amount of dramatic shit they did on one turn. I did this, and then I did this, and I got a crit, and that gave me an extra action, and then I got some things, and this is just a maneuver, so I could spend it on the maneuver because I still had a maneuver left, and blah, blah, blah. It was really fucking fun. It was fun as shit. In a certain way, it was then more fun than our game is now, right? However, we have to think of 10 levels. People are not just going to play this game for one session, right? So we have to plot and plan. And so a lot of the work we've done in the last 4 months has been stepping on that experience. I mean, like, this is too good. It's too much shit. It's too complicated. It's too many options. We are all designers. We're hyper educated on these things. So we're ready. James and I and the other people that work here, we are ready to take on more complicated shit. But we have to think about new players, especially one of the things we learned from these patron feedback is that it's very unlikely that our game, I almost said the name, it's very unlikely that our game is going to be anybody's first RPG. But we are discovering it is very likely that it will be thousands of people's second RPG, where they've never played any other game before. So even though we're having fun in this playtest, we have to stop and go, hang on a minute. If you're not a dev, you would be hugely overwhelmed by this. So we have to pick it apart and go, no, what do you get at second level? What do you get at third level? What does that progression arc look like? So yeah, there is if you had fun in the playtest, guess what? That means there's an even more fun version of the game coming. That's the one you play when you're third level. And you're like, I get it now. Now that I get it, bring it on. Give me more mechanics. Give me more powers. I'm ready for it. But at first level, it's super fucking easy. So just fun is not the only thing we're thinking about. We're also thinking about progression. We're also thinking about new players that have only played D20 Fantasy before. Fun has to sit in the mix along with presentation, along with learning, along with onboarding, all that stuff.
Putting the fun in function. So you've created a riot in chat. You've created a riot in chat where everyone is very excited to hear that there is a name and very offended that you won't tell them.
We'll reveal the name of the game when we have a license ready, which is we're already working on.
Thank you so much, James and Matt, for answering our questions. I look forward to the next time we get to chat. And you know what, chat? There's a name and you don't know it. And you can go to sleep tonight knowing that you don't know what the name is.